r/AmItheAsshole for revealing my adopted brother isn't dad's heir. Hashtag chunk 1. I watched Marcus lift his champagne flute and felt my stomach drop. The Riverside Country Club's grand ballroom was packed, at least 200 people, all dressed in designer clothes, all waiting to hear what my brother had to say. Waiters circulated with trays of expensive appetizers. The crystal chandeliers cast everything in an expensive, golden glow. This was supposed to be Dad's 65th birthday celebration, a milestone for the man who'd built Ashford Industries from nothing into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Instead, it was turning into Marcus's coronation. I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight, Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular confidence that comes from never being told no. Especially my father, who's taught me everything about business, about legacy, about what it means to be a true Ashford. I felt someone shift next to me, probably Mom, but I couldn't look away. My adopted brother stood there in his Tom Ford suit, one hand casually tucked in his pocket, the other holding that champagne flute like a scepter. He looked exactly like he always did, perfectly groomed, perfectly poised, perfectly convinced of his own importance. He'd been like this my entire life. I'm also thrilled to announce my engagement to Victoria Harrington, Marcus continued, turning to where his fiancée stood beaming near the bar. And while we're sharing good news, I wanted to use this moment, with all of you witnessing, to make an official statement. Dad's expression shifted. I could see the confusion flicker across his face. He didn't know Marcus was planning to announce anything formal tonight beyond the engagement. None of us did. That was always Marcus's style, though. The grand gesture. The dramatic reveal. The moment engineered for maximum impact. I want everyone here to know, Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room like he was addressing a board meeting rather than a family party, that I am ready to take my rightful place as the future CEO of Ashford Industries. I am the natural successor to my father's legacy. It's what I've been prepared for my entire life. It's what everyone in this room knows to be true. His eyes found me for a split second, not accidentally. It was deliberate. A little acknowledgement, a little dig. The look that said, we both know your place is nowhere near here. I felt heat crawl up my neck. For 22 years, I'd been on the receiving end of that look. For 22 years, I'd been the other Ashford. The mistake. The disappointing spare who showed up to family events and somehow never quite managed to fit into the narrative Marcus had constructed about himself. Dad had always been distant with me, kind enough but preoccupied. It was Marcus who got the mentoring sessions, the introductions to board members, the casual conversations about quarterly earnings and strategic planning. It was Marcus who Dad would place a proud hand on the shoulder of, the way he never did with me. I'd learned not to expect anything different. I want to assure my father and everyone here, Marcus continued, now truly in his element, that Ashford Industries will be in the hands of someone who actually belongs in those hands. Someone with the Ashford name, the Ashford blood, the Ashford. That's enough, Dad said quietly. The ballroom seemed to pause. Everyone had been listening, of course, but now that Dad had spoken, every head snapped toward him. He was setting down his own champagne flute with a deliberate clink against the table. We're here to celebrate, Dad said, standing up. Not to make announcements about succession that haven't been discussed with me. Marcus's smile faltered for just a moment. Dad, I thought you'd want me to. I said that's enough, Dad repeated. He looked tired suddenly, older than I'd ever noticed him being before. I'm not discussing my company's future at my birthday party. But Marcus, in his infinite confidence, just laughed. It was a bright, dismissive sound, the laugh of someone who'd never experienced real consequences. Come on, everyone knows where this is going, he said, and now he was looking directly at me again, that smirk spreading across his face. I mean, look at my brother. He's in college studying art history. He couldn't run a lemonade stand, let alone a multi-billion-dollar company. The Ashford legacy needs someone with vision, someone with business sense, someone who actually understands what it means to be a true Ashford. I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange, hollow, like it was coming from someone else. Is that what you were going to say? Marcus turned to me fully, that smirk still in place. Around us, the guests had gone utterly silent. Even the waiters had stopped circulating. I'm just stating facts, Marcus said smoothly. Nothing personal. But yes, a true Ashford. Someone with the blood, the instinct, the adoption papers, I said quietly. It took a second for my words to penetrate. Then Marcus's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something else entirely, something that looked like the first crack in his carefully constructed reality. What? The adoption papers, I said again, louder this time. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. You know, the ones that prove you're adopted. That your name isn't on the company trust. That you have no biological claim to any of this. I had documentation. I'd gotten the full story from Dad's lawyer 3 months ago, after I'd found something in our attic, an old file, hastily stored, clearly meant to be forgotten. I'd been sitting with that knowledge for 90 days, deciding what to do with it. Deciding whether it was my information to use, whether telling the truth was my responsibility. Now, watching Marcus's face go pale, watching Dad's expression shift into something unreadable, watching my mother's hands fly to her mouth, I realized I just made a choice I could never unmake. I just revealed the secret. And there was no taking it back. Hashtag chunk 2. The silence that followed was the kind that feels physical, like all the air had been sucked out of the ballroom and replaced with something thick and suffocating. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face in real time, watched his mouth open and close like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. Dad stood frozen at the head of the table. That's not, Marcus started, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. That's not funny. That's not a joke you make at. I'm not joking, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Underneath the table, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on them. I have the documents. Birth certificates, legal filings, everything. You were adopted when you were 3 days old. Your biological parents gave you up. You're not a blood Ashford. I saw Victoria's face in my peripheral vision, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to horror. She was putting it together, I realized. She was understanding what this meant for whatever life she'd imagined with Marcus. This is insane, Marcus said, his voice getting louder. This is a complete lie, and I don't know what kind of sick joke you're trying to pull, but... It's not a joke, Dad said quietly. Everyone turned toward him. He was still standing, but something about his posture had changed. He looked diminished somehow, like the announcement had taken something out of him that he couldn't immediately replace. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant in a way I'd never seen before. It's true, Dad continued, and I watched Marcus react like he'd been physically struck. You're adopted. I was going to tell you when you turned 25, but then you turned 25 and life got complicated and I kept putting it off. I should have handled this differently. I should have told you privately, years ago, before, he gestured vaguely at the room, at the guests, at the disaster now unfolding in real time. Before you built your entire identity around something that wasn't real. No, Marcus said, and his voice had changed. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by something younger, something wounded. No, you're lying. You're both lying. This is some kind of test or... It's not a test, I said. I pulled out my phone. I'd saved the documents as PDFs weeks ago, after I'd made copies. Part of me had always known this might happen. Part of me had been preparing for this exact moment. I can show you. Birth certificate with your biological parents' names, the adoption decree, the whole thing. Don't, Dad said sharply, and I looked up at him. His expression was raw, open in a way that made me understand, suddenly, that he was in pain. Real pain. Not the theatrical kind that Marcus specialized in, but something deeper. Something that had to do with failing someone he loved. Not here. Not like this. But it was too late. The moment had momentum now. People were whispering. Phone cameras were coming out, of course they were. This was the kind of family drama that people would be talking about for years. The Ashford family scandal. The secret heir. The golden boy who wasn't actually golden at all. Marcus was looking around the room like he was drowning, like everyone he'd been performing for his entire life had suddenly become hostile witnesses. His fiancée had her phone in her hand now, and I watched her face shift from shock to calculation. She was probably already thinking about what this meant for her, for the engagement, for the future she thought she was signing up for. I can't, Marcus started, then stopped. He looked at Dad. Why didn't you tell me? Why would you let me think, for my entire life, why would you let me believe? Because I was a coward, Dad said, and the honesty in his voice was almost worse than anger would have been. Because I didn't know how to tell you without hurting you. Because I was afraid of what it would mean for our relationship, for this family. And because... He paused, his eyes flickering to me briefly. Because I wasn't fair to your brother, either. I wasn't fair to either of you, and I'm only now understanding the full cost of that. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. For a second, I thought he might actually swing at me. The old Marcus, the one who'd spent years pushing me down the stairs metaphorically and occasionally literally, looked like he wanted to do it for real. But then his shoulders sagged, and he just looked broken. I need to, Marcus said, and then he just walked away. He didn't say anything to Victoria, didn't address the room, didn't do any of the things the old Marcus would have done. He just walked toward the exit with his head down. Victoria stood for a moment, watching him go. Then she set her champagne flute down very carefully and followed him. The moment they were gone, the whispers turned into full conversations. The spell of whatever had just happened shattered, and the ballroom erupted into the kind of speculation that I'd always known would happen, someday, once this secret got out. I just never imagined it would be like this. So public. So brutal. So completely beyond my ability to control or contain. Mom had her hand over her mouth, tears starting to stream down her face. I couldn't tell if she was shocked because she didn't know, if the adoption had been kept secret from her, or if she was crying because she understood exactly what I'd just done, the damage I'd just unleashed on our family. Dad looked at me across the ballroom, and for a moment, our eyes met. I tried to read his expression, tried to understand what he was feeling. Anger. Disappointment. Relief that the truth was finally out. Instead, he just turned away and walked toward the private exit that led to the club's offices. I was left standing in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by people with phones and questions and gossip, suddenly understanding that I'd made a choice in that moment that wasn't just about Marcus, or about the inheritance, or about justice or truth or any of the clean narratives I'd constructed in my head. I'd detonated something. A bomb that would keep going off for years. And I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. #Chunk 3. I made it out of the ballroom about 3 minutes after Dad disappeared. Not because I was following him, I wasn't that stupid, but because I genuinely couldn't breathe properly while surrounded by 50 people trying to casually ask me questions while recording everything on their phones. The club's foyer was quieter, all marble and soft lighting and a kind of aggressive welt that suddenly felt suffocating. I leaned against one of the columns and tried to get my hands to stop shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by something that felt closer to panic. What the hell were you thinking? I jumped. Mom had followed me out, and she looked furious in a way I'd never actually seen before. Mom was usually the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over and made excuses. Seeing her angry, genuinely angry, was somehow worse than anything that had happened inside the ballroom. Mom, No, she cut me off sharply. I don't want to hear whatever rationalization you've prepared. I want you to explain to me how you thought it was acceptable to detonate your family in front of 200 guests and the entire social register of the city. He humiliated me, I said, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into my voice. He stood up there and announced that he was the real legacy, the real heir, and that I was just. I know what he said, Mom interrupted. I was there. I heard it. That was arrogant and it was cruel, and yes, it was wrong. But do you understand what you've just done? Do you have any concept of the magnitude of what you've just blown up? The truth needed to come out, I said, and even as I said it, I could feel how hollow it sounded. The truth, Mom repeated, and she laughed, a brittle, painful sound. Is that what you're going with? This was about truth. Not about revenge. Not about proving something to your brother or to your father or to yourself. I didn't answer, because I honestly wasn't sure anymore. In the moment, in that white-hot flash of anger when Marcus was standing there declaring himself the true legacy, it had felt righteous. It had felt necessary. But now, watching my mother's face crumple with something that looked like betrayal, I was less certain. Your father didn't tell him, Mom said, her voice dropping lower. Do you understand that? Marcus has been adopted into this family, loved by your father for 25 years, groomed to take over the company, and your father never found the words to tell him the truth. And now you've done it in front of 200 people, and that's something he'll never be able to fix. That's a wound that doesn't close. So what was I supposed to do? I demanded. Just let him keep treating me like garbage. Let him continue to sabotage everything because he doesn't even know that he has no actual claim to. Yes, Mom said, and her voice was ice. Yes, actually. You were supposed to be the adult in this situation. You were supposed to think about whether your moment of satisfaction was worth destroying your family. He destroyed the family, I shot back. He's been destroying it for years, and nobody did anything because he was the golden child, the heir, the one who mattered. Stop. Mom held up her hand. I can't listen to this self-righteous justification right now. I really can't. What I need you to understand is that you didn't just expose a secret about Marcus. You exposed something about your father. You made public the fact that he lied to his own son, that he kept this massive secret for 25 years, and you did it in a way that humiliated him in front of everyone he knows. I hadn't thought about that. Not really. I'd been so focused on Marcus, on what this meant for the inheritance, on the satisfaction of finally proving that I wasn't the insignificant spare, that I hadn't really considered what it meant for Dad. And Victoria, Mom continued, her voice breaking slightly. That poor girl walked into an engagement party and walked out knowing her entire future just changed. You didn't just destroy Marcus's future, you destroyed hers too. For what? For pride. I didn't, that's not fair, I said, but even as I said it, I knew she was right. Victoria had been collateral damage. Everyone had been collateral damage. I need to go talk to your father, Mom said, and she was already turning away. I need to try to salvage whatever pieces of this marriage are still intact. And you need to think very hard about what you've done, and whether any of this was actually about justice or if it was just about wanting to hurt someone who hurt you. She left me there in the foyer, and I stood alone, staring at the marble floors and trying not to fall apart. My phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. And again. Notifications were rolling in. Text messages. Social media notifications. People who'd been in the ballroom, people who'd gotten messages from people who'd been in the ballroom. The secret was spreading, and spreading fast. I opened Twitter and immediately wished I hadn't. Hashtag #AshForDare was already trending. Someone had posted the video, someone had actually recorded the entire exchange. My voice was there, clear and devastated and furious, exposing the secret while Marcus's face went pale. And underneath it, comments were already piling up. Speculation about the inheritance. Theories about why the adoption had been kept secret. People doing the math on what this meant for Ashford Industries' succession plan. I closed the app. My phone rang. Dad's lawyer. Of course. Whatever legal implications this had, he would be having thoughts about them. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked out of the club and into the cool evening air. The parking lot was already chaos, people leaving early to get ahead of the news cycle, probably. To post their first-hand accounts. To be the ones breaking the story before it got broken for them. I stood in the parking lot and thought about what Mom had said about wounds that don't close. I'd spent 3 months sitting on that information, and I'd told myself it was about deciding if it was my place to share it. But the truth was simpler and uglier than that. I'd been waiting for the right moment to maximize the damage. I'd been waiting for the moment when Marcus would be at his most vulnerable and public and exposed. And I'd found it. And I'd detonated it. And now everything was broken, and I had no idea how to put any of it back together. #Chunk4. I made it home around midnight, which was a mistake because it meant walking into a house that was already occupied by the aftermath. The lights were on in Dad's study, all of them, blazing like he was searching for something he'd lost in the dark. I could see his silhouette through the frosted glass door, sitting at his desk with his head in his hands. I'd never seen my father like that. Dad was always composed. Even when business deals fell through or the market tanked, he maintained this kind of controlled competence. But this looked like collapse. I almost kept walking. Almost went straight to my room and pretended none of this was happening. But Mom's voice from earlier was still ringing in my ears. You made public the fact that he lied to his own son. So I knocked. The sound was too loud in the quiet house. Dad's head snapped up, and for a moment we just looked at each other through the glass. Then he said, "Come in," and I did, and the door closed behind me with a soft click that felt final. "I assume you've seen the internet," he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." He laughed, a short, bitter sound that didn't belong to him. "Sir. You're calling me sir now. That's what we're doing." "Dad. Do you have any idea what you've done?" He stood up, and I realized he was actually shaking. Rage or shock or both. "Do you understand what kind of position you put me in? Not just with Marcus, not just with the family, but legally. Professionally. The company's stock is already tanking. My board is calling. The press is calling. And I'm supposed to explain what, exactly? That I've been lying to my own son for 25 years. That my biological child decided to expose that secret at a public event for maximum humiliation. He humiliated me first, I said, and I could hear how weak it sounded. So you nuked the entire family in response. He wasn't asking. That's your defense. He was mean, so you destroyed his engagement, his reputation, his future, and incidentally blew apart your mother's peace of mind and my entire carefully constructed life. I'd never heard him sound like this before. Angry, yes, but also hurt. Betrayed. Like I'd personally stabbed him. I didn't know what else to do, I said, and it came out as almost a whisper. He's been telling me for years that I don't matter. That I'm the disappointing spare. That nothing I do will ever measure up because he's the real heir, the real legacy. And every time I tried to talk to you about it, I what? Dad demanded. You took his side. You always took his side. The words hung in the air between us. Dad's face went very still. You don't think I knew that? He asked quietly. You don't think I was aware that I was failing you? That I was so busy trying to make sure Marcus felt secure in his position, so busy trying to prove that adoption meant the same as biology, that I was neglecting the child who was actually mine. I didn't know what to say to that. I was going to tell him, Dad continued, and he sat back down heavily. I've been planning to tell him for months. After his engagement was settled, after the company restructuring, after, God, there's never a good time, is there? There's never a moment when you can tell someone their entire life has been built on a foundation that doesn't exist. Then why didn't you? The question came out more accusatory than I intended. If you knew, if you were planning to tell him, why did you let him keep treating me like I was nothing? Because I was a coward, Dad said flatly. Because I was terrified that if I told him the truth, he would hate me. That he would feel like his entire childhood was a lie. That he would resent me for not being his biological father. And I couldn't stand the thought of that. So I let him believe he was the heir, let him feel secure in that, and in doing so, I let him hurt you. I know that. I've always known that. The admission hung there, and I realized I'd been waiting my entire life to hear him say something like that. But now that he had, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ruins of something that could have been fixed if I just had patience. If I'd just talked to him instead of detonating. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again. That will be the press, Dad said. Or social media. Or Marcus. He's called me 17 times. He's at a hotel. His engagement is off, obviously. Victoria's family is threatening legal action for emotional distress. Legal action? For what? It's not like You publicly humiliated their daughter on what was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of her life, Dad interrupted. You revealed information about her fiancé's parentage in front of 200 people, most of whom were probably recording. They're claiming emotional distress, reputational damage, and they're threatening to sue. Which means I'm defending you, which means the company is defending you, which means this is now an official legal matter. I didn't think. No, he agreed. You didn't. And that's almost worse than if you'd done this with full malicious intent. At least then there would be some logic to it. Instead, you acted on impulse and rage and hurt, and you took the rest of us down with you. Another buzz. And another. You should turn your phone off, Dad said, and he sounded exhausted now, beyond anger into something that looked like resignation. Or at least stop reading it. The internet is vicious, and you're the villain in everyone's story right now. The spoiled biological heir who destroyed their adopted brother out of spite. Is that what you think? He looked at me for a long moment. I think you made a catastrophically bad decision in a moment of justified anger. I think you're 22 years old and you haven't learned yet that revenge is a luxury that people with families and responsibilities can't afford. And I think we're all going to be paying for this for a very long time. He turned back to his desk, which was now clearly a dismissal. I left without another word. In the hallway, my phone buzzed again and again. Messages from people I barely knew. Requests for interviews. Hate mail. And in the midst of it all, a single text from an unknown number. Asterisk, we need to talk. This isn't over. M asterisk. Marcus. Of course. I turned my phone off and sat in the darkness of my room, finally understanding what Mom had meant about wounds that don't close. Hashtag chunk 5. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me, every creak and groan feeling like judgment. Around 3 a.m., I heard voices downstairs, Mom and Dad, their conversation too low for me to make out words but clear enough in tone. She was upset. He was defending something. Or maybe himself. The thought made my stomach turn. My phone stayed off. I knew that was cowardly, that turning it off didn't make the messages disappear, just delayed the inevitable moment when I'd have to face them. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Not while everything still felt raw and unreal, like I was watching someone else's life implode from behind thick glass. By morning, the house had a strange quality to it, muffled, like everyone was moving through water. Mom didn't come down for breakfast. I found her in the sitting room around 8, pretending to read a book that was clearly just a prop. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked smaller somehow, like the events of yesterday had physically diminished her. Hi, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. She looked up, and I watched her decide something. Not forgiveness, exactly. But something like resignation. Your father is at the office. He's trying to manage the stock situation before the markets open fully. The board is in a state. She turned a page she hadn't been reading. Victoria's parents have officially contacted a lawyer. Dad mentioned that. They're looking at a settlement. Probably they'll want a public apology from you, some kind of statement that this was a private family matter and not a deliberate attack on their daughter. She finally met my eyes. Which it wasn't, was it? You were angry at Marcus, not at her. No, I agreed quietly. I wasn't angry at her. That won't matter much to them. They don't care about your emotional state or your reasons. They care that their daughter's engagement ended in humiliation. Mom set the book down carefully. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that this isn't just between you and Marcus anymore. You pulled a thread, and now there are people unraveling who had nothing to do with the core of what happened. I sat down across from her without asking permission. Dad said he's defending me. Legally, I mean. Yes. Which means he's also defending the company, which means this is now a corporate matter, which means every decision made going forward will be calculated to minimize liability rather than actually fix anything. She paused. Do you understand what that means? That your father can't afford to take your side emotionally right now because taking your side is a legal liability. The words hit different from when Dad said them. Coming from Mom, they felt less like punishment and more like explanation, a roadmap of the minefield I'd created. What about Marcus? I asked. What about him? He texted me. This isn't over. Mom's expression shifted into something sharp and concerned. Do you think he meant that literally? I don't know. I don't. I don't think he'd hurt me or anything like that. But I don't know what he's planning. If he's planning something, that's something you should probably tell your father, she said. Although depending on his legal team's advice, even that might become a documented liability. The implications of that hung heavy between us. I'd created a situation where everything was now evidence. Everything was now a legal matter. We couldn't just be a family working through a crisis anymore. We were parties involved in potential litigation. My phone stayed off through the morning, but around noon, there was a knock at the front door. I heard voices downstairs, the housekeeper, and then someone else. Someone young and male. Marcus. I stayed in my room, but I could hear him. I need to talk to my brother, he was saying, and his voice sounded different than it had at the engagement party. Raw. Desperate. Just 5 minutes. Please. I heard the housekeeper apologize, say that I wasn't available, but Marcus pressed anyway. Just tell him I'm here. Tell him I want to talk before the lawyers get involved. Before this becomes completely irreversible. My stomach twisted. Part of me wanted to go down there. Part of me was terrified. What would I even say to him? That I was sorry. That I hadn't meant to destroy him. That I was just as much a victim as he was, caught in Dad's lie. All of it was true, and all of it would sound like excuses. I heard the front door close after a few minutes, and then silence again. But knowing Marcus had been here, had tried to see me, changed something. This was no longer abstract. This was real and present and getting more complicated by the hour. Dad came home around 5 p.m. looking like he'd aged 5 years. He went straight to his study without acknowledging me, though I saw him do a double take when he realized I was in the living room. Marcus came by, I told him. Something flickered across his face. What did he want? I didn't see him. The housekeeper said I wasn't available. Dad nodded, but he looked troubled. Don't see him. Not right now. Not without legal counsel present. I know that sounds extreme, but right now every interaction between you two could be interpreted as evidence of either reconciliation or ongoing conflict, and we need to control the narrative. The narrative, I repeated. He's my brother. He's also someone who's hired a lawyer, Dad said, and he sounded sorry. I found out this afternoon. Marcus has retained counsel. They're exploring options for legal action against you. They're claiming defamation, emotional distress, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The words didn't immediately make sense. He's suing me. They're exploring it. They haven't filed yet, but they're preparing to. Which means anything you say to him right now could be used against you. He sat down heavily on the sofa, looking at me like I was a stranger. I know you wanted honesty. Well, here it is, we're going to court. Probably not criminal court, but civil. This is happening. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This had stopped being about family dynamics somewhere between yesterday's revelation and right now. Now it was legal. Now it was official. Now there were lawyers involved, and liability, and settlements, and all the machinery of the law grinding forward, indifferent to the fact that we were supposed to be related. What do I do? I asked. Nothing, Dad said. You wait. And you don't talk to anyone. And you hope that our legal team can minimize the damage. He paused. And you start thinking about whether revealing the truth was worth this, because I'm no longer sure it is. #Chunk6. The days that followed existed in a strange suspended state. I went to classes because not going would have drawn more attention, but I barely registered what professors were saying. My laptop screen would blur, and I'd realize 20 minutes had passed without me absorbing a single word. People noticed. Or maybe they always did and I was just finally paying attention to it. The way conversations would stop when I entered a room, the careful distance people maintained, like failure or scandal, was contagious. My roommate, Devin, tried to be normal about it for exactly 2 days before giving up. Look, I don't know what's going on with your family, but the internet is having a field day with it, he said on the 3rd day, not looking at me while he said it. Like, there's threads on Reddit, investment forums are talking about your dad's company, and your brother's fiancé or ex-fiancé or whatever posted something about betrayal on Instagram. It's bad, man. You should probably get off campus if you can. I hadn't thought about that. I'd been so focused on the legal machinery grinding forward behind closed doors that I hadn't considered the public dimension. Of course there was a public dimension. My father's company was publicly traded. The board was already panicking about stock fluctuations. And now random people on the internet knew my family's secrets, were weighing in on them, judging them. Thanks for the heads up, I told Devin, who looked relieved to have passed along the information and could now feel absolved of social responsibility. I drove home that evening without telling anyone I was coming. The house felt different when Dad wasn't in it, less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Mom was in the kitchen when I walked in, and she looked up from her laptop with an expression of barely suppressed alarm. What's wrong? Did something happen? No, I just needed to get away from campus for a bit. I sat down at the kitchen island. People know. About the adoption. About Marcus. About everything. Of course they know, Mom said, not unkindly. Your father's company is worth $300 million. His potential heir was just revealed to be an adopted son with no legal claim to the inheritance. That's not a private matter anymore. That's business news. She turned her laptop around to show me. There it was, a headline from a financial news site. Succession crisis at Sterling Industries, adoption revelation shakes up executive dynamics. Below it was a less official headline from a gossip blog, the heir nobody knew, how one college kid blew up his family's billion-dollar dynasty. $1 billion. I'd never thought of it that way. I'd known intellectually that my father was wealthy, but seeing it quantified like that, seeing my family reduced to a financial news story, made it feel obscene. Your father's legal team is very unhappy with the public attention, Mom continued. They wanted to keep this quiet, contained to family and business circles. But once it hit social media. She made a gesture like something exploding. You can't contain that. What's Dad saying? Very little. His team has instructed him not to comment publicly, which is smart legally but makes him look evasive. And Marcus, she paused. Marcus has been smarter about the optics than you or your father. I looked at her sharply. What do you mean? He gave an interview. Not to anyone major, but to a podcast about family dynamics. He positioned himself as the victim. He talked about finding out at a public event that he wasn't biologically your father's son, after being raised his entire life to believe he was. He didn't mention the adoption papers. He didn't mention that he knew and had decided not to tell you. He just presented it as a sudden, humiliating revelation that your father apparently had never planned to disclose. The cunning of it struck me immediately. Marcus had reframed the narrative. He wasn't the liar anymore. He was the victim of a lie. And by extension, he made my revelation look like an act of cruelty rather than an act of truth-telling. Did he mention me? Only in passing. As the biological son, who apparently always resented him for being the favorite. He suggested that your motivation was jealousy, not righteous anger about being lied to. Mom closed her laptop. It's actually very effective. By the time someone fact-checks it, the emotional impression is already made. I felt something collapse inside me. So he's winning. Winning is maybe not the right word. But he's controlling the narrative better than you are, which in a public relations sense is almost the same thing. She stood and opened the refrigerator. Your father is furious. His team is preparing counter-statements, trying to get ahead of it, but every time they respond, they're playing defense. What do they want me to do? Nothing, as far as I know. Stay quiet. Don't give interviews. Don't post anything on social media. Let the lawyers handle it. She pulled out ingredients for dinner as if this were a normal evening. Of course, staying quiet also means letting Marcus control the story, but apparently that's preferable to the alternative. Dad arrived home around 7 o'clock, and I could tell immediately that he already knew I was there. Mom must have texted him. He looked older than he had a few days ago, like the stress was physically aging him in real time. We need to talk, he said, which were becoming my 4 least favorite words. We went to his study. He closed the door carefully, as if the house itself might be listening. I know you've seen what Marcus did, he said without preamble. The podcast thing. Mom told me. It's extremely clever, from a legal standpoint. He's positioning himself as the wrong party, which actually helps his case for emotional distress. He's framing this as something that happened to him rather than something he concealed. Dad ran a hand through his hair. My team wants to respond, but I need to know first, are you willing to do an interview? To tell your side of the story? I thought about that. About sitting across from someone with a camera or a microphone and explaining my motivations. About trying to make people understand why I'd been angry, why I'd felt justified in revealing something that wasn't really mine to reveal. Would that help? I asked. Legally? Maybe. Emotionally? Probably not. But we're past emotional at this point. We're in damage control. There was that phrase again. Damage control. As if what had happened could be controlled at all, as if it wasn't already spreading like wildfire through networks and news cycles and Reddit threads where thousands of strangers were weighing in on whether I was right or wrong. I need to think about it, I said. Dad nodded slowly. Don't think too long. Every day Marcus gets to control the narrative is another day our position gets weaker. He turned away from me, already reaching for his phone, already moving on to the next crisis, the next strategic decision. And I realized that this was what Mom had meant. This wasn't about us anymore. It was about liability and narrative control and legal strategy. We were no longer a family working through something. We were a problem to be solved. #Chunk7. The interview was scheduled for Thursday at a downtown studio, which gave me 3 days to prepare. 3 days to craft a narrative, to anticipate hostile questions, to practice looking sincere on camera. Dad's PR team sent me a document titled Message Guidelines, which was essentially a script with bullet points about my emotional journey and my commitment to family honesty. I didn't recognize myself in any of it. The document kept using the word betrayed. I felt betrayed by Marcus's deception. I was the victim of a years-long manipulation. My motivations were pure, I simply wanted the truth to come out. Every sentence was designed to make me sympathetic while making Marcus look worse, and the entire thing made me want to throw up. You don't have to follow it exactly, the PR consultant, a woman named Jennifer who'd been assigned to brief me, explained on Wednesday. She was probably in her 50s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested she'd spent decades managing other people's disasters. Think of it as a roadmap, not a script. You want to sound natural. Authentic. Cameras can tell when you're being fake. But isn't the whole point to be a little bit fake? I asked. To present the version of myself that looks best. She smiled like I'd said something charming rather than cynical. The point is to present the truth in the most sympathetic light possible. There's a difference. I wasn't sure there was. The night before the interview, Marcus called me. This was shocking enough that I almost didn't answer, thinking maybe my phone was glitching or the universe had decided to implode. But no, it was really him. His voice came through low and careful, like he was calling from somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. I know you're doing the interview tomorrow, he said without preamble. I wanted to give you a chance to back out. Back out? I couldn't help laughing, though there was no humor in it. Why would I do that? Because once you do this, once you put yourself out there on camera and commit to this narrative, it's going to get worse. A lot worse. He paused. I could hear him breathing. I've been getting advice from a very good lawyer, and she told me that if you go on camera and make statements against me, I have grounds for a defamation suit. You'd have to prove that what you said was true. Which, technically, it is, but proving it publicly, in court, with depositions and cross-examinations, that's going to drag Dad through hell. It's going to drag all of us through it. You're threatening to sue me. The audacity of it was almost impressive. I'm warning you. There's a difference. I'm giving you information so you can make an informed choice. His voice had taken on that reasonable, measured quality that somehow made everything worse. After tomorrow, you lose the ability to take this back. You understand that, right? No matter what happens, this interview exists forever. It's going to define how people see you. How people see me. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and immediate. Marcus, you've been lying to me my entire life. You knew. I know what I did. I'm not denying it. I'm trying to explain that your revenge isn't going to feel as good as you think it will. And when the lawsuits start, when the depositions happen, when you're being grilled by my lawyer about every detail of your motivation and every conversation you had with Dad, that's when you're going to wish you just let this go. Then why are you calling? Why not just let me destroy myself? Because, and here his voice cracked slightly, despite everything, despite all of it, you're still my brother. And I'm trying to save you from making a decision you can't undo. He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the dark of my room for a long time after that, trying to figure out if what he'd said was genuine concern or just another layer of manipulation. With Marcus, it was impossible to tell anymore. Maybe it had always been impossible. When I told Dad about the call, he looked grim but unsurprised. He's testing you, Dad said. Seeing if he can scare you off. His lawyer probably told him that's a bad strategy, but he's emotional right now and he's going to try anyway. What if he's right though? About the lawsuit? He probably could file. Whether it would succeed is another question. Defamation requires you to make false statements. Everything you've said is true. Dad paused. But he's also right that it would be expensive and ugly to defend against. Everything gets dragged into the open. Every family argument, every business decision I've made, every detail of my personal relationship with both of you. So maybe I shouldn't do the interview. That's your decision, Dad said. But I'll be honest, backing down now after everything that's happened. That makes you look weak. It makes it look like Marcus intimidated you into silence. And it means he wins. Everything keeps coming back to winning and losing. I don't think we're even playing the same game anymore. The morning of the interview, I woke up with a migraine. Not metaphorical, not stress-related in an abstract way, but a genuine, pounding, nauseating migraine that made it hard to see. I called Jennifer and told her I needed to reschedule. You can't reschedule, she said, and I could hear the panic in her voice. This has been set up for weeks. The interviewer has already cleared their schedule. If you cancel now, it looks like you're running scared. It looks like Marcus got to you. So everyone will think what's actually true. That's not the point. The point is optics. I took 2 ibuprofen that did nothing. I sat in my room and waited for the pain to either kill me or diminish. It did neither, it just kept throbbing, a physical manifestation of the impossibility of my situation. Dad drove me to the studio anyway. The whole way there, neither of us spoke. He just kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and I kept my eyes closed and tried to breathe through the pressure in my skull. The studio was smaller than I expected. The interviewer, a man named Richard with an aggressively casual demeanor, shook my hand and told me everything was going to be fine. He'd heard my family's story. He thought I was very brave to come forward. The camera was a red light that blinked on when they started rolling. And I realized, sitting there with makeup covering the dark circles under my eyes and Jennifer watching from just off camera with her message guidelines in her lap, that I didn't actually know what I was supposed to say. Not the polished version, I knew that. But the real version. The true version. I didn't know if those things were even the same anymore. #Chunk8. The red light blinked. Richard leaned forward with the kind of rehearsed sympathy that probably worked great on people who hadn't been living in a nightmare for the past 6 weeks. So, he said, let's start with the moment you found out. I opened my mouth. Closed it. The migraine had faded to a dull throb, probably because my body had finally accepted that pain was just going to be my baseline now. I found out, I began, and then I stopped. Because I realized, sitting there with the camera rolling and my father waiting in the green room and Marcus's threat hanging over everything like a sword, that I had a choice. Not between truth and lies. But between what would look good and what would be honest. I found out, I started again, that my entire childhood was built on a foundation I didn't understand. And instead of handling it like an adult, I blew it up. Richard blinked. That wasn't in the script. I could see Jennifer shift uncomfortably in my peripheral vision. I thought I wanted justice, I continued. I thought I wanted people to see what Marcus had done to me. How he'd manipulated me, belittled me, sabotaged my relationship with my father. And all of that is true. But the way I went about it, publicly humiliating him, destroying his engagement, turning my family into a PR disaster, that wasn't about justice. That was about revenge. And I think I finally realized that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. So you regret coming forward? Richard asked, sensing a different kind of story now. I regret the way I did it, I said carefully. I regret that I had to destroy someone to feel like I mattered. Even if that someone had spent years trying to make me feel worthless. This wasn't the narrative Dad's team had prepared. I could feel Jennifer's panic from across the room like heat radiation. But I also felt something else, a kind of lightness. The lightness of not performing anymore. Here's what I think, I said, and Richard leaned back, realizing this had become the kind of interview that people actually wanted to watch. I think my brother is also a victim. Not of me, obviously, I did plenty of damage. But of my father, who raised him his entire life to believe he was special, destined, chosen. And then my father built a business empire and never sat down to have a real conversation about what would happen if his assumptions changed. We were all just living in a story my father wrote, and we didn't even know we were in a book until the whole thing started falling apart. Your father is here today, Richard said. How do you think he feels about that characterization? I don't know, I said. Probably angry. Probably disappointed. Probably wondering where he went wrong. But I think he also knows it's true. We went on for another 40 minutes, but that was the core of it. I talked about the adoption, about the documents, about Marcus's betrayal of me and my betrayal of him. But I also talked about my father's failures and my own. I talked about the choice I'd made to go nuclear instead of having difficult conversations. And I talked about what I'd learned in the aftermath, which was that there were no clean victories. That destroying someone else's future didn't actually fix anything about mine. When it was over, Jennifer looked like she wanted to cry. Dad looked something more complicated, not exactly proud, but maybe relieved. Like I'd finally said something true, and that truth, even if it wasn't strategically optimal, was somehow more valuable than all the calculated sympathy in the world. 2 weeks later, Marcus called again. This time he came to my apartment instead of just calling. He looked thinner than I remembered, like the past month had actually consumed him from the inside out. His fiancée had left him. He'd taken a leave of absence from the company. He was living with Mom and going to therapy, which he told me like it was a confession. I watched the interview, he said. We were sitting on my balcony, not looking at each other, just looking out at the city. 3 times. And I realized you were right about me. But also, I realized I was right about you. He paused. You didn't have to destroy me to matter. You could have just mattered. Without proving it to anyone else. Yeah, well, I'm learning that, I said. I'm going to therapy, he said again. And I think I'm going to tell Dad that I don't want the company. I think I need to figure out who I am when I'm not the heir. When I'm not the golden child or the victim of whatever psychological warfare he was unconsciously waging. That's good, I said, and I meant it. I think he'd appreciate that. I'm not doing it for him, Marcus said. I'm doing it for me. And eventually, maybe for you. So we can actually be brothers instead of enemies fighting over the same inheritance that we never even wanted in the first place. I didn't know if we could rebuild what we destroyed. But for the first time since all of this started, I thought maybe it was possible. Not because anyone had won, but because we both finally admitted that we'd lost. 3 months later, Dad had a conversation with both of us. Not about the business. Not about inheritance or succession or legacy. Just about what we actually wanted, now that we had to figure out who we were without the story he'd written for us. It turned out Marcus wanted to be an architect. It turned out I wanted to finish my degree and maybe work in education. It turned out my father, when he actually had to listen instead of just manage, was capable of accepting that his children's lives didn't have to look like his. The company will eventually go to someone. Maybe a professional CEO. Maybe one of us will change our mind. But for now, it's enough that we're making choices that are actually ours. I think about that night before the interview, when Marcus called and warned me that some choices can't be taken back. He was right. I can't undo what I said. I can't undo the months of chaos and pain that followed. But I also can't undo the fact that finally, after my entire life, I'm becoming someone real instead of just a character in someone else's narrative. And maybe that's worth something after all.